All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the Korea Economic Institute of America. I'm Arius Dare. I'm the Director of Communications here. I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's event. It's called Recalibration in the Indo-Pacific, Perspectives from the Region. Now, what this event really is a preview for our Spring-Summer 2025 issue of Korea Policy. This is KEI's flagship academic journal. We have just tremendous contributors, personally big fans for this latest issue. 3 of them are on the stage with me now, and 2 more you will meet very shortly. Now, I've had the chance to read their advanced drafts, and I think without question, each provide really important clarity and understanding at a time when I think all of us would agree is a really unpredictable and unorthodox time in geopolitics. Now, broadly speaking, while each of these contributors cover a different country's or national perspective, I think together there's sort of 4 broad concepts that I think each author is trying to grapple with. And I think the first is what sort of dilemmas and opportunities U.S. China competition creates. I often think that from the Washington perspective, this is a universally negative proposition. But from my time in Australia and also from reading these papers, there's a far more pragmatic and nuanced view of a rising China, both politically, economically. In the way that South Korea, Vietnam, and others are thinking about this are some of the things that we're going to touch on today. The second broad theme is, I think, is hegemony an accurate description of the current world order anymore? Are we already in a multipolar world? Do we have spheres of influence specifically in the Indo-Pacific region? And if so, what does that look like for smaller powers? Thirdly, the world's largest economy, the world's richest country, the United States, is seemingly embracing trade illiberalism, an almost neo-mercantilist approach to goods and commerce and services crossing borders. What does that mean for trade-heavy countries? What does that mean for a country like Singapore, for example, that depends quite a bit on international capital flows? Lastly, it also seems that Washington is, let's say, re-envisioning its role for U.S. security, for global security and U.S. commitments in the Indo-Pacific region. Does this mean that other partners in the Indo-Pacific are going to step up, as the Washington might say, and help take responsibility for their own defense? Or does this mean that, say, revisionist powers, revisionist actors are going to take advantage of that new space? So I think broadly speaking, these are sort of 4 sort of unifying concepts that each of our authors today are sort of looking at. And they examine the above questions from multiple national perspectives, including South Korea, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, and Singapore. KI is going to publish the spring-summer issue of Korea Policy digitally in late May, early June in 2025. I'll make sure that everybody on the RSVP list gets an exclusive link to download the PDF when that is live. In the meantime, you can read our past editions. We have a number of these available when you exit today. And this is just the most recent one, but it goes back a few editions as well. Very, very briefly, our run of show, it's going to be 75 minutes for the first panel here, and then 60 minutes for our second. We'll have a 5-minute interlude between. Each panelist today is going to speak for roughly 12 to 15 minutes about their research, about their findings. And really the secondary reason why we're all here, the free lunch, that will be after the second panel. So I encourage you all to stick around. Now let's introduce our panelists. I do not have time to introduce all of their accolades and research and affiliation, so this is going to be a brief version. I encourage you all to read our website to get their full bios. But first, we have Dr. Guyan Chang. She's an associate professor of political science at the Kangwon National University. Her research focuses on American and South Korean foreign policy and security issues in the Indo-Pacific, including regional security architecture, maritime security, and gray zone conflict. Next, we have Dr. John Blaxland. He is the director of the Australian National University's North America Liaison Office and Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies in the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs inside the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. Also, prior to academia, John had a long career in military intelligence as well, which I think really comes through in his research, looking at this from more of a practitioner role often and helping us apply some of these broader level concepts on a day-to-day basis. Lastly, we have Sayuri Romay. She is a Washington-based senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific program. She leads work on Japan and heads the Japan Trilateral Forum. Her research focuses on U.S.-Japan relations and security issues in the Indo-Pacific. So without further ado, Dr. Chung.
Thank you, Arias, for your kind introduction. So, my name is Kuyun Jung. I'm associate professor at Kawan National University. So I'm discussing South Korea's perspectives about current Indo-Pacific landscape, and as well as the United States policies, and especially Trump administration's kind of foreign policy kind of natures, and how it actually constrain regional countries and allies. For instance, like South Korea, their kind of behaviors and their strategies. So today I will talk about 4 points. First, I will discuss the nature of the concept of retrenchment. And then I will discuss how Trump administration's retrenchments are different from the previous one, and how it actually leading up to strengthening the narrative of multipolar orders in the regions. And against that background, how South Korea's position has become more vulnerable, especially more so because South Korea is under the political uncertainty after the martial law declaration. So my argument is this. So basically, Trump administration, after the inaugurations, kind of rapidly implementing the policies which capitalize on like economic nationalism or populism, which emphasize the deficiency of the United States, which actually encapsulated by the idea of retrenchment, core argument of America First foreign policy. Well, America First policy is actually try to achieve the primacy or regain the primacy, but the way they are conducting this America First approach, for instance, like retrenchment, is actually serve as kind of challenges or obstacle to reclaiming U.S. primacy for Trump. The reason, I think there are many explanations about why America First cannot actually make United States more stronger is this. So my understanding is that the nature of U.S. power is more likely coalitional power. It is not just about primacy about the United States, but also that primacy and leadership has been supported by regional allies and partners, especially the leadership part, the norms and rules and institutions has been created or sometimes conceptualized by Canberra like a strategic constraint. But that has been receiving support from the regional allies. So that's why the sustainable kind of nature of U.S. Leaderships since World War II. But when Trump administration actually kind of challenged the idea of coalition hegemony and kind of making the allies and partners as challengers and competitors, so the entire orders or entire nature of U.S. primacy is kind of crumbling down at this moment, and which actually changing the nature of interacting between U.S. and allies and partners here. So within that context, I will discuss this retrenchment and the nature of Trump administration's retrenchment policy. So when it comes to retrenchment, it is not just new. Every administrations, many administrations in the United States and other countries used to take the policy of retrenchment when, in other words, scaling back the grand strategic commitment in response to a decline in relative power. So basically, it contains like changing kind of priorities, mitigating risk, or increasing burden sharing with allies. And it is not new. It's not just about Trump or other Trump, but even United States, some administration like Obama and Biden used to take this approach as well. But the thing is that, so that's why there is always kind of pro and cons about retrenchment. Those who oppose retrenchments usually realist, argues that it shows U.S. weaknesses and embolden U.S. Kind of adversaries. Those who support retrenchment argues that it preserves U.S. primacy in the future, not just today. So there's always pros and cons, and even Obama administration, which is Democrats, they used to take this approach, which is actually characterized as a multilateral retrenchment. In other words, they reduce the commitment, especially military commitment, but at the same time, they expand their commitment in a diplomatic way in different domains, especially economy as well as social and norms and other domains. They try to mitigate the concern and risks generated by the regional partners and allies. So it's kind of compromise. They're reducing a commitment, but at the same time, they are making engagement much further. So that is actually why Trump administration's retrenchment make it more peculiar. It's kind of making more nervous about regional countries' kind of concern. So I would characterize Trump administration's retrenchment as a illiberal retrenchment because of those 5 regions. Well, first, retrenchment by accommodating revisionist powers' requests, especially Russia. When it comes to war in Ukraine, Trump administration kind of hastily tried to minimize the crisis escalations. And the second one is a lack of commitment to liberal democracy or rule-based orders, like not just Trump, but like Vice President J.D. Vance commitment during the Munich Security Conference, kind of praising the authoritarian political parties and kind of criticizing allies in the NATO. And also, as we can see from the current trade wars, perceive allies as a competitor, not a partners. And also this kind of long-standing kind of problem, strategic insurgency within the Department of Defense. In other words, reducing forwarded presence in Indo-Pacific as well as European continents will raise another concern for the allies and partners as well. This unilateral kind of reducement or retrenchment is actually characterized why it is a kind of illiberal retrenchment. And also, last but not the least, I think many experts in the Washington, D.C. discussed this reverse Nixon strategies, how United States tried to improve the relationship with Russia actually does not weaken the Russia-China alignment. So all of this illiberal retrenchment is actually creating regional allies more concerned about the sustainment of U.S. primacy or the effectiveness of America first foreign policy. Not only it is creating the concern for the allies and partners, but also it is overall the entire global landscape is generating into more the multipolar orders. That's the kind of more issue for the regional countries and allies because once during the Biden administrations, of course, the overall patterns and distribution of powers are pretty similar, but at the same time, there was an effort by the United States to kind of maintain solidarity within allies and partners. But Trump, as I said, is trying to making each other compete one another. So which makes that we are kind of, rather than align with allies and partners, previous allies and partners, we are trying to maintain more strategic autonomy, as in the case of European Union, and East Asian countries are trying to move into that direction these days. So when it comes to South Korea, I think I have a few times to discuss South Korea. After martial law declarations and President Yoon failed to be reinstated, so we are kind of anticipating another presidential election in this June. But as everyone knows, South Korea's polarized political environment, especially not just the domestic political environment, but the foreign policy and their perception on U.S., China, Japan, and North Korea, everything is polarized. So given that polarizations, different parties, especially progressive parties and conservative parties, have different solutions to how South Korea navigate this great power politics and even maintain strategic kind of autonomy in the regions, especially like conservative party, well, pretty much similar to the Yoon administration's positions, like strengthening U.S. ROK alliances, maintaining trilateral cooperations, and also conducting the Pacific strategies. And in spite of Trump administration maintaining really good relations and expanding, deepening the cooperation. So that kind of foreign policy initiatives will be maintained. But when it comes to progressive, it is not just more about like hedging between U.S. and China. They begin to discuss how South Korea can maintain strategic autonomy, considering kind of multipolar orders in the regions in the global environment, which makes them hedging, not just hedging between U.S. and China, but hedging between all the kind of great powers in the region. So I think that kind of South Korea's position will make the entire world order more multipolar. And if South Korea take that position, then it will kind of create chain reaction to Japan and other countries as well. So I think when it comes in the Pacific, I'm not sure how United States will lay out this Indo-Pacific strategy and trilateral cooperations, and most importantly, how Trump administration will discuss the Taiwan and North Korea issue. But every kind of issues and hotspots may be differently approached by the new administration if there will be a regime, kind of different administration after the June election. So I'll stop here. We'll discuss more during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. Dr. Blaxland.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. And thank you. It's really great to follow Kuyon's paper. I'm going to take a look at things from an Australian perspective. And on the side, you can see my slides, which I'm not sure if the audience online is going to be able to see or not. But it's the first one is it's a Royal Australian Air Force planning map centred on Darwin, but spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia and of the Indo-Pacific. And of course, you can see there how Korea and Australia are very much in that space. And of course, Korea and Australia, US allies. We've been the spokes, if you like, to the hub and spokes arrangement over the years, finding ourselves more and more needing to collaborate across the spokes, inter-spoke collaboration on the rise, in fact, spiking, you could say. It's been on the rise in the last few years, and it's certainly on the rise. So one of the things I've been working on, a recent paper I wrote called Adapting to Polycrisis, a national security strategy for Australia. It actually predates the Trump election victory. But in it, I talked about what I define as the polycrisis, which is an overlap of great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges, and by that I mean terrorism, people smuggling, drug smuggling, civil war, breakdown of law and order, internally and externally, accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution, or what you could say is kind of like everything, everywhere, all at once. But of course, what we've seen though is what appears to be a fundamental change in the United States' approach to international engagement. And I say appears to be because, you know, as an academic, there's not enough data out there yet to be conclusive. And scholar friends of mine have said, John, have cautioned against making pronouncements about a new administration only 2.5 months in. Mindful that, of course, you know, the George W. Bush administration, its first 8 months were focused on China, but that's not what we remember George W. Bush for. It's the war on terror, it's Iraq and Afghanistan, of course. So having caveated my remarks that way, it's useful to think about the images here of the first administration there of Angela Merkel facing off with Donald Trump the first time, and of course in the second one, the dressing down of Vladimir Zelensky by the president and vice president. That we've seen that, you know, they're walking away from American institutions. These are institutions that only are made possible by the San Francisco Treaty. Where is San Francisco? It's not in Kazakhstan, right? Where is the UN headquarters? It's not in Moscow. It's in the United States of America. So it's actually for, you know, small and middle powers like ours to look on, and it's hard to get our heads around why the United States, that was actually so foundational to these institutions emerging in the first place, would walk away from them. Why you would not push back rather than retreat. So this retrenchment that you've been talking about, Kuyon, is it's baffling. And the talk of annexation of Canada, Greenland, and Panama, it's like, are you serious? You know, it's like, is this part of the art of the deal or not? The Canadians certainly don't feel that way. They're feeling very much that it's getting more and more real. You know, as I say, there's critics, and you know, in academia, there's more critics of the rules-based international order than you can poke a stick at. But I say it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire. Not holy, not Roman, not an empire. But it still existed, right? And that's kind of like the rules-based international order, which Korea and Australia have been enormous beneficiaries of. In fact, the whole world has, really. I mean, we've all kind of, the prosperity, we sell stuff to you, confident that no one's going to torpedo the ship, no pirates are going to get it on the way, and then when it gets there, you're going to pay, and if there's a dispute, we can go to arbitration. Now, that is a set of mechanisms that did not exist prior to 1945, right? We have been taking them for granted, thinking that this is just normal. It's not. It's actually an aberration in history, right? And yet it is also something that I would have thought the United States should be very, very careful about retreating from or retrenching from. So it's very alarming for all of us as we look on and seeing friendships with Xi, Putin and Kim Jong-un and, you know, democratic allies being dressed down for apparent infractions. So what are we seeing here? Is it Yalta 2.0? Of course, Yalta the first time, we saw Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin carve up the world, essentially. And if you ask the Poles in Poland, and I was there just recently, that sends a shiver down their spine, right? The idea that you would actually retreat from ideational leadership and that you do this from purely in terms of great power politics. But it gets to what you were saying about this retreat, apparently, or retrenchment from the unipolar moment. This is a kind of conceding. It appears, as I say, it's conjecture, hypothesis at this stage, but the evidence is gradually coming in on this, that we're seeing a concession that the United States no longer sees itself as the unipolar power, and that it's being prepared to accept a more multipolar world. And that's a world that kind of is reminiscent of Thucydides and what he wrote about in the Peloponnesian War, where he talked about the causes of war being about fear, honour and interests. Now, I am not a supporter of the Allison thesis about the Thucydides trap, but I flag it there because it's a kind of the colloquial sense of understanding of Thucydides. I think there is an interpretation of Thucydides that has relevance for us, and I've written about that in that piece for the Melbourne Asian Review, and for the Diplomat, actually, talking about the important for us to think in a very hard-nosed way in terms of realpolitik about how we pursue our interests in a way to reduce the prospects of war, to deter war, and to work collaboratively with like-minded countries. And here I'm thinking particularly South Korea and others. Mackinder springs to mind as well. Who would have thought that we'd be revisiting Mackinder and the heartland theory of Eurasia as being of any consequence in the 21st century? That if the retreat into a multipolar world is anything to go by, then I think that does resonate, as does Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations, where he articulated the 9 aspects of national power, 9 elements of national power in his classic realism approach to international relations, which has, I think, utility in us revisiting in this day and age, as we think about what options does Korea face, what options do Australia and other like-minded countries have, as we think about our elements of national power, how we respond to the Trump administration's proddings, goadings, reactions, and how we best position ourselves to ride out the storm. And I say storm because there are people out there saying the sky is falling, right? There's a lot of chicken littles out there saying the sky is falling. The order, as you know, is coming to an end. I'm of the view that that is overly dramatic, that we are seeing, no doubt, a big storm. It is very stormy. It's a dark storm. But to say the sky is falling, I think, is to overstate the mark. But it is useful to reflect also on Mahan and the influence of sea power. It certainly seems to be influencing Chinese thinking with the incredible expansion of the People's Liberation Army Navy, its Coast Guard and its maritime militia. on a scale that is completely caught us ball flat-footed. None of us are in a position to really catch up at this stage. And I think also Michael Green's book, By More Than Providence, speaks to an enduring phenomenon which gives me some reassurance that we don't need to catastrophize here. And his overarching concern, as he points out, driving US policy towards East Asia, is a fear that a rival power might use the Pacific to isolate and threaten the US and prevent the ocean from becoming a conduit for the westward free flow of trade, values, and forward defence. Now, I think Michael's right, and I think that has enduring relevance for America, for the United States, as it thinks about its power dynamics and the Mackinderite theory. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump has read any of these works, right? I don't think that that's probably the case. I do think, though, that foundationally these are underpinning kind of concepts that inform his worldview. But I may be wrong. But we are seeing a shift in global power dynamics, and the Lowy Power Index is, I think, a useful point of reference. And I've added to this the graph that they've produced, Canada and France, because they're Indo-Pacific powers in a way that I think the Lowy Index should also recognise. But this is not quite Morgenthau's 9 elements of power, but it is a useful, there's a similar kind of articulation of 8 elements of power that you see here. And when you look across at Asia, you see, you can understand that from DC, when you look there, you see China, China, China. And of course, from down under, and I think from South Korea as well, you get a much more diffuse picture, because you see these other elements, of these other nations having influence, having agency, having a role to play, that it's not binary. And despite what Alison might say about the great power dynamics and it all being about China and the US, we have agency. Okay, and I think that's an important point to note. In the meantime, the BRICS is rising, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa arrangement with Indonesia joining it just a few weeks ago. I think in a way that's kind of a bit of hedging going on there from them. But of course, the dynamics in this space is an extraordinary growth in Chinese military spending, pictured there in the left. Which is, countries like Korea and Australia, we're playing a little bit of catch up now, but from a low base, because we haven't felt the need, but we're now feeling much more pressed to respond to a much more significant challenge, bordering on existential challenge. And the picture on the other side shows the extraordinary growth of Chinese trade dominance in the quarter of a century since it joined the World Trade Organization, that I would contend echoes the emergence of the British Empire. Now, the British Empire happened over 250 years. They had the Industrial Revolution, they needed raw materials, they needed markets, they then needed security for their raw materials and markets, they then needed governance for the security for the raw materials and markets. Happened incrementally over 250 years. This has happened in 1/10 of that time, in 25 years, right? What does the next 25 years portend? I don't know, but it's got enormous implications for Korea and Australia. And in the meantime, we've got a fracturing, a splintering of the world, and this is manifesting in politics in Australia, and from my opaque reading of Korean politics, it's manifesting in Korea as well. This splintering and kind of polarizing, polarizing is not the right word because it's not a binary, it's a multi-pronged splintering of evidently irreconcilable political views in domestic politics. It's generally generating really toxic challenges in politics. So I think we're facing a series of challenges. As a military historian, I like to think about the application of power, and we see over time the incremental increase from land and sea to then air in the First World War, and then space with the V2 rocket that ended the Second World War, and then of course at the end of the 20th century the emergence of the cyber domain, the digital revolution. And all along we've seen the cognitive domain, not the hardware or the software, but the wetware, the 6 inches between our ears. And I would contend we've been fixated on Clausewitz and chess, and I think this is thinking that appears to be the way that the current administration is thinking here in Washington. And I think it's probably more appropriate for us to think of the metaphor of the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, for whom the acme of skill is to defeat your adversaries without fighting. And for which the game metaphor I think is more appropriate is go, not chess, where you're not trying to remove the players, but envelop and force to capitulate. And that's kind of what I see happening. It's happening in the Pacific, it's happening everywhere, I would contend. And this is what I'm saying is happening, the competition prism. So we're seeing it's not war and peace, It's a grey zone in between where we're having to compromise, collaborate where we can, cooperate, contest, and sometimes confront. And that includes with Australian aircraft flying the no-fly zone, the exclusion zone around North Korea, even though China and Russia have retreated from that. Still a contested challenge. Of course, we've seen China saying it's ready for war, and we've seen the circumnavigation of Australia in a way that seems pretty normal for you in the Korean Peninsula. It's not normal, it's becoming normal, if you like. So here, I think, gets to the rub. What are we facing in terms of what might war look like? Of course, we know my colleague Brendan Taylor talked about the 4 flashpoints, the Korean Peninsula, East China Sea, South China Sea, and Taiwan. And when we think about the Taiwan scenario, I think the Korean War echoes today. We remember Dean Acheson in January 1950 went to the National Press Club, declared that America's interests extended to the border of Japan, and by implication not Taiwan, not Korea. All right. 5 months later, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-un's grandpa, invades, thinking he's been given a green light. Of course, the United States reacts viscerally. The Soviets walk out of the UN Security Council. The UN Command is formed. Once and only do they walk out. The Korean War's fought for 3 years. Over 1 million Chinese die, including Mao Zedong's son, for a border that looks like it was before it started. Why would you do that again? No self-respecting Chinese leader wants to do that, but they still want to win. So how do you do that? I would contend that article in Foreign Affairs articulates it quite well about squeezing, not seizing. And my ambassador here in DC, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, talked about managed strategic competition as the way to avoid war. And I think that's broadly right. But we are seeing that competition manifest across the Pacific. And this is, I think, something that players here in Washington, DC overlook. America's interests in the Pacific are extraordinary. They're not just dots, they're incredible. If you add the EEZs, as the map shows here, over to your left, an extraordinary American footprint in the Pacific, which is not going away anytime soon. So America's interests in that space are enduring. There are over 20 votes at the UN General Assembly in the Pacific and another 10 or so in Southeast Asia. That's 30-odd votes in Southeast Asia and the Pacific that are up for grabs. And we're seeing in the Solomon Islands, Kiribati and Tonga, security pacts with China, squeezing out Taiwan, squeezing out us, squeezing out the United States, and in a way that I would contend is inimical to Korea's interests as well as Australia's interests. So it makes for an interesting, a dawning realisation that we all have a stake in this, that it is bigger than our own individual domestic security and challenges of our immediate territories, but that we are part of a unrestricted competition, I would say. And when we think about the prospects here, I think it's useful to think of our predicament in the broader geostrategic context, particularly of the sea lines of communication and the Malacca dilemma, or the jugular vein of the Indo-Pacific, I like to call it, where 70% of East Asian trade transits through Malacca Strait. Of course, goes a long way, I think, to explain the Belt and Road Initiative, an attempt to mitigate the risks for China of a confrontation in East Asia that would expose them to some kind of Japan-like sanctions of like 1941. They don't want that. So in the meantime, for Australia, we've got a fear of abandonment. We've got an alliance that's an 800-word essay. There's no commanding general, there's no headquarters, there's no forces assigned, there's no Article 5. Korea has a slightly different set of circumstances, but you also have a fear of entrapment. Like us, we're worried about the United States dragging us into a war. We've been into almost all of them with the United States so far, and we're a little bit worried about the prospect of war in Taiwan. I'm more sanguine about that, but there are others. And of course, now what? And as I say, and as this piece in the New York Times observes, Trump aims to unbind the executive from constraints imposed by other branches and the normal process of administrative lawmaking. What I think is happening here is the left railed against globalism, hoping for a socialist global nirvana, right? And guess what we got? Instead, we got a Jacksonian nationalism, disinclined to care about international relations and international institutions. It's not isolationism, though. It's mercantilist unilateralism, I would contend. And we're seeing is a transactional retreat from ideational leadership. the ideas that formed this international order that the United States has played a foundational role in, they seem to be retreating from. And so what? Well, for Australia, we had a foreign policy white paper in 2017, which I called Australia's Foreign Policy Plan B, which is what we wrote when the Trump administration came in the first time around. And essentially, we reach out to everybody else who'll be our friend. That includes Korea, across ASEAN, the Pacific Islands, Indian Ocean, the Quad, AUKUS, the Firepower Defence Arrangement, NATO, and a range of free trade agreements, including with Korea and many other countries. This is under review now. So Australia and Korea have more cause to look to each other, to swap notes, to see how we can encourage the United States to remain engaged constructively, to not completely diss the RBIO, the Rules-Based International Order, and to actually recognise that Australia and Korea, amongst others, are actually as good of friends as you're going to find. So you don't diss them unnecessarily. So what, for Australia, the prospect of Australia's defence being dependent on the whim of Donald Trump points to the need to muscle up on our own. I would contend that applies to Korea as well. And we also have a challenge of reconciling economic and national security. This has become more acute since the tariffs, but for Australia, we're in a slightly different predicament because we are an exporter of raw materials primarily, not advanced technology, so it makes it a bit different. And we are a big believer in free trade, in stark contrast to the Trump administration. For us, this network of free trade agreements is actually foundational to our prosperity, and we are great believers in it. We hope you are too, and I think we need to stand strong in defence of that, of those free trade agreements and their efficacy. In the meantime, in this space is Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a proto-great power, you could contend, but with many differences, with countries in this space hedging and bandwagoning, and I would contend with the tariffs now we're probably going to see a bit more bandwagoning going on, which I think is a real shame. AUKUS, I won't dwell on that, but I can talk about it in the Q&A if you like. But for Australia, we face a spectrum of challenges, the likes of which we've dealt with individually in the past, but not collectively. So for them to happen concurrently is presenting us with a conundrum, the likes of which we have not seen in my lifetime. The bluff again, the bottom line up front, we're dealing with great power competition, looming environmental catastrophe, a spectrum of governance challenges accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution, and that's manifesting itself in politics in the United States, which has enormous ramifications globally for Korea and Australia and beyond. Thank you very much.
Dr. Blackland, thank you. And last but not least, Ms. Ramey.
Thank you, Arius, and thank you so much, KI team, for including me on this really important panel looking at the perspectives of allies in the Indo-Pacific. And yeah, we're not even 3 months in this Trump administration, and I feel like there's so much to talk about. And I also share a little bit of that sentiment where many of the things, towards allies, U.S. allies, was expected, but also I can't wrap my head around a lot of the aspects that you mentioned. So thank you. Anyway, this is a really important conversation. Things are changing really swiftly in international politics, and Japan is one of those countries who are dreading a shift in the global order. Japan is deeply worried about a shift from a unipolar post-Cold War era where the United States had the primacy towards a more of a multipolar world where different states have power and are vying for influence. And I thought it was really interesting that this year's Munich Security Index showed that Japan shows the highest degree of anxiety towards this shift. Of all the 17 countries that were surveyed. So Japan shows 54% of the Japanese respondents indicated that they're concerned about this, the prospect of a multipolar world. So from Tokyo's perspective, this shift has serious consequences on, especially on 3 of the elements that are that consist in the national interests of Japan. So first of all, preserving the liberal international order. Second, maintaining a strong U.S.-Japan alliance and U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific. And third, economic security, which is very closely tied to national security for Japan. Now, what kind of impact can this new Trump administration have on these Japanese national interests, and how is Japan navigating these changes? So I'd like to highlight three points today. First of all, let me talk a little more about Japan's national interest to uphold the liberal international order. So this order, of course, it's based on the rule of law, and Japan made it clear that it will not accept any unilateral attempts to subvert it. So Japan is a status quo power par excellence, and as it benefited from a unipolar world where the U.S. had primacy. And as stated by many Japanese officials, and as underscored in the 2022 National Security Strategy, preserving the liberal international order is one of the main interests of Japan. So naturally, that also means that having a strong U.S.-Japan alliance is something that's essential for Japan. Now, one real challenge that's causing an erosion of confidence in the United States is something that Professor Blaxland also mentioned. It's Washington's radical shift on the war in Ukraine, for example. Former Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, he supported Ukraine very clearly, very firmly. I'm sure you're all familiar with his famous phrase, Ukraine today, maybe East Asia tomorrow, which was repeated countless times, reported in the media as well. And this is not just rhetorical support, but Japan ranks fourth among countries that provided aid to Ukraine. And President Trump has changed the U.S. stance dramatically. And I'm sure you've all seen the disastrous meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky at the end of February. So this divide between Japan and the Trump administration is creating a dilemma for Japan, right? How to strengthen its relationship with the U.S. if Washington is not on the same page about preserving the liberal international order. Secondly, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that this Trump administration is very different from the first one. So we may see shifts in the U.S.-Japan relationship as well, and because of this difference. Trump is no longer a brand new leader, brand new president. He is now a second-time president, and back in 2016, even he was somewhat surprised that he won the elections. Not anymore. He has been saying very angrily for the past 4 years that the elections in 2020 were stolen from him. So there is a little bit of animus there as well that was built up. He has more of a fixations now on certain policies, on certain aspects. So I think his presidency is really different. And of course, the Prime Minister Ishiba, President Trump dynamic is also very different from what we had back then with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe with President Trump. Back then, Abe sort of poised himself as a mentor to Trump. That's not going to be the case anymore. The first bilateral summit between Ishiba and Trump went smoothly, but there are still a lot of concerns, especially because Ishiba is now drowning in low ratings and low approval ratings in scandals. And so he has to really focus on domestic issues right now. He's in a very politically weak position at home, especially in light of the upcoming elections in July in Japan. So there isn't much room for him to have this kind of important presence as Japanese leader. And that, of course, will have an impact on the kind of negotiations that Japan will have with the U.S. And one more thing I'd like to mention in this difference is that this time we're going to have the negotiations for the host nation support agreement that's set to expire in 2027. So that was not the case last time, but this time Japan will have to negotiate with this Trump administration, and I expect the negotiations to be lengthy and very difficult. So there's more, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if you'd like. And then finally, I'd like to highlight Japan's efforts to maintain this status quo by developing a network of partnerships in the region beyond just the US. So how will that play out in the next few years? The Free and Open Indo-Pacific vision, FOIP vision, unveiled by Prime Minister Abe in 2016, that was designed to strengthen not only Japan's alliance with the US, but also to develop partnerships in the region and beyond. And in the past 10 years, Japan has been quite successful at developing these friendships and alliances. It has taken part in many trilats, minilats. Of course, there's the Quad, the trilat with the Philippines, trilat with ROK, bilat with Australia, with the EU, with NATO, of course. And so Japan has been branching out very successfully, has been diversifying its partnerships, and I expect many of these to become more and more important for Japan to pursue. So yeah, I'd like to conclude by saying that surprise, surprise, Trump's return to the White House has brought about new fears and some anxiety in Tokyo. And I see that there's a gap widening between a Japan that is still deeply committed to the free and open international order based on the rule of law, and the US, who doesn't seem to be very interested in upholding it. And despite its reluctance to accept a shift towards a multipolar world, Japan's recent efforts to build up its own network in the region may progressively push Japan to develop into a regional pole as well, but I don't think we're quite there yet. Now Tokyo finds itself in a dilemma between maintaining a strong relationship with Washington, which is essential for its national security, and continuing to pursue its strategic goal of preserving the liberal international order, a goal that doesn't seem to be shared by the US. So the question that Japan will need to address in the coming years is whether it will decide to deepen its ties with this US administration at the expense of its pursuit of its strategic goal, or strengthen its relations with other partners whose national interests and values align a little better with Japan right now, at the risk of weakening the US-Japan alliance. So this fundamental difference in worldviews between the US and Japan right now will inevitably become a growing challenge that may drive a wedge between the two allies over the next 4 years and maybe beyond this Trump administration. I'd like to finish it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, before opening up the room to questions, and those online, if you would like to type any questions into the live chat, we have somebody here who can read those out to the panelists. I wanted to give anybody here a chance to, well, rebut would be the more fun option, but maybe just more engage, comment on some comments from your fellow panelists.
Oh, thank you. Well, Professor Braxland and Lome's kind of introductions about your perspectives, your country's perspectives about the current situation is very important. But so after listening to your conversation, it seems like every regional countries are converging into kind of strengthening their own autonomy and flexibility during the Trump administrations. And if that's the case, do you see there will be a kind of solidarity between like-minded countries other than United States? Because when I kind of visiting other countries and other conferences, there are discussions that we need to discuss more and create more platform to discuss regional issues and global issues. And if that's the case, how do you think the United States will kind of react, or what's your kind of impromptu kind of response?
That's a great question. And look, I think there's a lot of potential for Australia to work much more closely if that's possible. I mean, Australia's already working very closely with Korea and with Japan. And let's face it, I mean, we've got comprehensive strategic partnerships. We've got trading, security, educational connections that are pretty world class. The ties are very, very close. And those ties have been encouraged by the United States. We in the post-Cold War years, the connection between the spokes has been something that's been fostered by the American order. But in addition to that, being kind of tied in with the United States system over the last 70 or 80 years has meant that we have a lot of points in common. So we operate in English, and in terms of technologies, in terms of intelligence, in terms of surveillance, in terms of military capabilities, there's a high degree of compatibility. Australia's, we've got deals with Japanese, Korean companies are manufacturing military equipment in Australia in a deal that reflects the fact that there's a high degree of compatibility that was implicit in Australia and Korea collaborating. And there's a prospect, under negotiation at the moment for Australia to be purchasing potentially Japanese warships, which speaks once again to the high degree of compatibility. One of my previous incarnations was as a Chief of Joint Intelligence in a Joint Operations Command. We had a system, a wide area surveillance system that we operate called the JCDX, Joint Command Data Exchange. It's the same system as the Americans use with Korea and Japan, right? There's a high degree of interoperability between us that has been predicated on American benevolence, if you like, generosity of spirit, and their own self-interest, to be honest, in the pursuit of their national interests, that has seen an overlap of interests and then an overlap of applied engagement. That has left, and for us, the legacy now is that we have enormous points of overlap that we can capitalise upon. And to be honest, my sense is that if, and it's a big if I'm right about what the United States interests in East Asia look like, then that still includes Australia, Japan, Korea, and others, including the Philippines, Singapore, and others, perhaps, working as collaboratively as possible. So it's not inimical with this newly constructed sense of what America's interests are, even though it's kind of played down the rules-based order. Nonetheless, in terms of a realpolitik calculation of American interests in East Asia, and if it's about checking China, then working with the three of us is as important as ever. And so my sense is that if we play our cards right, this is not going to incur the wrath of a taciturn presidency. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Chung. I think it's a really important question, and as Professor Blackson mentioned, there are already some really good partnerships among our countries and other countries, for example, ASEAN, or even like the EU. And so I think these partnerships will need to grow, will definitely need to grow. That's a priority. And it's interesting to see also, for example, the European countries' growing interest in ASEAN, for example, and someone like a country like Japan could facilitate that kind of partnership. So I think there are so many opportunities there that don't necessarily involve the U.S., but at the same time, the U.S. is also at the center of some of these key trilats. For example, the U.S. Japan ROK trilat is something that's very much on my mind since the beginning of the Trump administration. As you know, we had a really good momentum going on. Then the South Korean political situation, as you mentioned, is very precarious right now, and we don't really know exactly how it's going to play out with the next administration in Korea. And the U.S., for example, in this trilat is still very important, and I think Japan, on its part, will continue to, it's in a dilemma, as I mentioned, but at the same time, it will continue to try to engage the U.S. In these kind of trilats. I think that kind of constant engagement of the U.S. is still important from South Korea, from Japan, Australia. I'm also curious to hear about your perspective on this particular trilat, on the future of it. I know that the operational side of this trilat is definitely continuing. We have lots of some good operational like joint exercises that are going on and that will going on for the next few years. But on the leadership, political side, it seems really shaky right now. So yeah, that's one of the questions. But to talk about the U.S. interests, the Quad is something that seems to be on the forefront of the Trump administration's priorities. Secretary of State Marco Rubio attended the Quad meeting, the Quad summit, just like hours after he was inaugurated, making it very clear that this was a priority for this administration. So I feel like there are some things that will stay the same and maybe will get stronger, but Japan, South Korea, Australia may need to engage the U.S., Washington a little bit specifically on these specific partnerships. But yeah, back to you, Professor Chung.
Well, there are different kind of multilaterals that South Korea is joining, but when it comes to trilateral or cooperation between U.S., South Korea, Japan, both progressive and conservative conceive it as very important assets, especially when it comes to this kind of balancing against North Korea. But the problem is whether it will be used against China. Because as Trump administration mentions about the role of U.S. forces is put more emphasis on kind of deterring Chinese or not only North Korea but Chinese coercion as well. If that's the case, then trilateral cooperation will be kind of used like that directions. Then if that's the case, then progressive political parties and progressive politicians are less likely to support kind of multilateral cooperations. But when it comes to North Korea, it is always kind of welcomed. So it depends on types of more specific strategies, how new administration kind of perceive this situation. So I think.
Yeah, maybe one more thing I'd like to add on the North Korea piece. I feel like that's a big unknown from the Trump administration, and it's something that we've seen in his first term, how he dealt with North Korea directly, directly having this kind of dialogue with the North Korean leader. But yeah, this time he already, I think at least twice, has mentioned North Korea, has called North Korea a nuclear power, which it didn't upset Japan, but you know, it was a little bit of a, it made the news in Japan for sure about the kind of engagement that the Trump administration and Trump himself will have with North Korea, as you know, that would also be a little bit of a different objective from what Japan is seeking, which is complete denuclearization and, you know, package deal with the abductees and all of that. So that North Korean piece is also something that's interesting, that will be interesting to watch.
Yeah, actually, I'll just add some of the kind of things that kind of discussing in South Korea. So it is not just about kind of North Korea's nuclear weapons, but recently North Korea declared this two-state doctrine between two countries, that it will not pursue kind of peaceful unification one another's. So that actually changed the strategic landscape on the Korean Peninsula, like whether South Korea can pursue unification policy in the future, or North Korea will be kind of re-engage South Korea in any kind of domains like economy or security or social. So that was another questions we have to think. And if that's the case, then whether Trump administration have an incentive to engage North Korea in the first place, compared to the first administration where he put very much assets and emphasis in the first kind of few months in the first administration, I think. And he tried to kind of start the summit and dialogue. But here at the second administration, he more focused on like a Middle East, Ukraine, like a kind of containing Chinese influence in the North East Asia rather than North Korea's nuclear weapons. So I'm not sure whether the United States actually see that denuclearization is a plausible kind of goal, or rather focus more on arms control and minimize the risk. So it depends on how Trump administration kind of choose the path. So that's the kind of uncertainty South Koreans have, whether United States will actually kind of support South Korea's effort to denuclearize North Korea.
This is a fascinating conversation. I hope we might expand that to include questions from the audience. Yes. It's coming around with a mic.
Is there a microphone? Yeah, good. I'm Gil Rosman of the ASEAN Forum, and thank you for your presentations. As I understand them, they are really contradictory. There are two approaches that are basically modified bipolarity. We got to still deal with China. We got to keep the U.S. involved somehow. And the other approach is we've got to deal with China, and we got to think of multipolarity in a way where China is a pole, and we're back to old notions in Korea of balancer, NAPC, Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative. Korea can somehow play a special role. And I'm wondering if we can clarify what is multipolarity. I mean, clearly, Trump, I don't think Trump believes at all in multipolarity. He does want to have some kind of grand agreement with China and Russia, but I don't think he accepts others as equal powers that he wants to deal with in that fashion. And I certainly don't think he accepts Korea as a country that can balance China against the United States. So I think a lot more clarity is in order on what is meant by multipolarity, and particularly whether Korea is still influenced by some kind of illusion about its power to influence the great powers rather than really being unable to have much of an impact.
Yeah. My answer. Okay. So thank you, Professor Roseman, for your good question. So I think your question is really valid, and understanding United States polarity and whether South Korea can balance against other great powers, that answer itself is polarized by progressive and conservative in South Korea. And as you can see from, and also progressive and conservatives have different ideas about whether South Korea is developed as it is under the rule-based orders. And that much, each side has different appreciation of the value of rule-based order and liberal international orders. So I think it depends on who actually win the elections in June and how they forge this new foreign policy and forge a kind of different relationship with the United States and even Russia and China. And they try to maintain maximum kind of flexibility. And also progressives are more critical about this value-driven diplomacy, which has been kind of conducted by Biden and Yoon administrations, because it makes South Korea's foreign policy more kind of constricted or restricted, given that we are more likely to work with more democratic countries rather than other countries. So that kind of very multifaceted kind of discussions are going on in South Korea these days during the times of this presidential election time. So I think we will see. We will see which party actually win the elections in June. But whoever wins the elections, I think everyone has kind of prepared for the kind of Trump administration's illiberal kind of behaviors, and they will kind of take that behavior as a kind of challenge to South Korea's foreign policy.
It is quite interesting. If we had the same panel in 3 months, we might actually have 3 different leaders in each of these countries. Australia has an election in May, Korea in June, and Japan in July. So it's just interesting to see how quickly things might change just over this summer or this winter down under. I want to move just a little bit quickly for the sake of time. If we do not ultimately give you an opportunity to ask a question here, do stick around for lunch. Our panelists will be here from panel 1 and panel 2. You can pick their brains then. Terrence.
Hi, Terrence Matsuo. I'm a non-resident fellow here at KI. Thank you for KI for hosting this, and I look forward to reading everybody's papers. So very quickly, I think all of the panelists have basically said that all of the respective countries are just perplexed over the changes in the United States. But Professor Chung, specifically, you've kind of mentioned how South Korean progressives may be more inclined for hedging, given the changes in the United States. And so I guess my question is, quite briefly, and perhaps a little too broadly, is, under what conditions do you see these changes in the United States affecting these countries' perceptions of their alliance with the United States? Do you see, or kind of under what conditions would we expect to see, not from the United States' side, but from South Korea, Australia, and Japan's side, seriously questioning the need, value, and continuance of the alliances? Thank you very much.
Me again. So I think the kind of foreign policy kind of attitude of South Korea has kind of suddenly changes, especially kind of right after Trump administration's kind of inauguration, I think. Of course, progressives and also progressives kind of priority when it comes to foreign policy is kind of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. So the behavior of the United States and a behavior of like-minded countries surrounding Korean Peninsula has been perceived as kind of destabilizing the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia. That's kind of different perceptions about how United States role and how kind of trilateral cooperation is kind of working in the Northeast Asia. So that kind of perception has been there for a long time among progressive bloc, but the rise of Trump administration is actually catalyzing their concern more, because not only they are kind of destabilizing, but also they have very little commitment to the alliance as well. So yeah, so that's kind of reinforcing one another, but the catalyzing factor was Trump administration's kind of victory in the presidential election.
Just on Australia, just briefly. It's interesting because we've got an election in just a few weeks' time, and how that pans out will, I think, shape the answer to that question that you asked. Because the two principal centre-left and centre-right parties are consistently arguing that the alliance still matters and that they're trying to ride the storm. But the leftmost major party, the Greens, which has been a fairly minor political actor on the federal political stage in Australia, has been taking a more hardline approach on the alliance lately, and the question is whether that more hardline approach is going to get more traction. And certainly, there is in the left wing of the Labor Party, which is the centre-left party, the left side of the party is increasingly very sceptical of the United States, so the current Prime Minister, who's a centre-left leader, the Labor Party leader, has been having to deal with the challenge of holding the party together in light of far less ideational congruence, if you like, between the United States and the current Trump administration and Australia. That depending on how that goes, it will shape how Australia responds. If either the centre-left or the centre-right parties come out on top with a clear majority, then I think we will continue to hold on and hope that this storm will pass and that the tariffs will lift, that we'll see a return to a more prominent role for the United States in ideational leadership on the global stage, as opposed to this transactional approach. But even with this transactional approach, we might be able to, weather it, if you like, weather that storm and manage relations regardless. So, one of the things that strikes me is people in the current administration don't seem to get that our three countries are democracies, that people have a vote. They're watching and they're in horror. They're in shock. And so there are repercussions for American power because a lot of American power, historically, yes, it's backed by hard power, but there's a soft power dimension to it which makes it palatable politically in democracies. And it is vaporizing at the moment. And it's really deeply unnerving.
Yes, over here.
Hi, thanks. I'm Shantanu Roy Chaudhary. I work on China-South Asia relations. There's been great talk on the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral, but I wanted to ask about South Korea, Japan, China trilateral, and where do you think that's heading given the current scenario? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. That's the other piece that's interesting, and especially how China-Japan relations also will move forward. That's a big question. And of course, after in preparation for the Liberation Day that we had last week, there have been lots of reports on the media saying that China, Japan, and South Korea have become a little closer to talk about trade. But for now, I think that was reporting from the Chinese media, and Beijing is probably trying to drum that up a little bit and try to Beijing is maybe trying to make the U.S. understand that if this is where the direction that the U.S. is going, then it will see its allies getting closer to China, right? But when you look at the media reports from the Japanese side, for example, you will see that Tokyo is actually much more cautious about this kind of relationship with China. So of course there has been a dialogue, but that's just the beginning, and we don't really know where that will go. And I can talk about Japan-China relations, and there are obviously ups and downs all the time, depending on where the U.S. is going as well. But it's still a little early to say where this is going, and I'm sure that the trilat is a little bit about the same. Again, I want to say that this is still the beginning. We should be cautious about what we're hearing from Beijing alone. So we'll see.
From South Korea's perspective, China, Japan, and ROK trilateral is Yeah, it is important in the sense that we have to engage China to agree with North Korea's and denuclearization as well as maintaining stability on the Korean Peninsula. So role of China is still important, even though North Korea is more aligned with Russia at this time, but the relationship between China and North Korea is still there. So we have to engage China to be on board in South Korea's effort to kind of denuclearization and deter against North Korea's any provocation. And at the same time, United States has emphasized its de-risking strategy in the economic domains, but many of South Korea's industry are still there. We are maintaining kind of supply chains, and we have conducted a number of onshoring, but reassuring. But still, there are many industries and kind of factories. So we have to make sure that our kind of economic assets are kind of well secured and maintaining stable economic relationships. So in that sense, that trilateral is still important. But more importance, more prioritized will be on the ROC, U.S. and Japan trilateral.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, Joseph Liao from Singapore. Thanks for the presentations. There was mention about this perennial issue of fear of abandonment, right? And I think a few people mentioned it. I wonder if we can, I understand it in the security realm, but we set that aside. Looking at the trade realm, which is essentially what is bothering all of us at this point in time, can we turn that logic on its head in the sense of what can the region do without the United States? Can we imagine the region without the United States? Can we abandon the United States? Yeah, RCEP has been created. Can it explore the possibility of European EU membership, Canadian membership, India rethinking membership? Because the terms have changed, right? The terms have changed since RCEP was first conceptualized. And I think there is good reason for the Europeans, the Canadians, the Indians to rethink, or at least certainly in the case of India to rethink. And there's certainly good reason for those of us in RCEP to rethink as well the composition of RCEP post-US. I think, challenging times call for creative measures.
No, that's a great comment, Joseph. Thank you. I think it's a good thought for us to explore because, I mean, the United States retreat from TCPP, RCEP, and even IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's like it's a sandpit with no sand, and now, of course, it's not owned by the Trump administration, so who knows. I've heard nothing on IPEF since the new administration has come in, but I'm not anticipating wonders at all. You raise a very good point. There is a real importance for us to actually add ballast to the economic dimension of our relationships and diversification. And Australia, certainly since the sanctions were imposed on us a couple of years back, that $20 Australian billion worth of sanctions, we saw a real effort to diversify our trade. So we're now looking to re-energise the prospects of a free trade agreement with Europe. We've got some with, obviously, Singapore and across the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand free trade agreement. We're a great believer in free trade agreements and in fostering greater collaboration. Of course, as you know, Australia-Singapore relations are about as good as you can get. In fact, it's uncanny. I reckon the Australia-Singapore relationships are like the Australian-New Zealand relationship. It doesn't get much closer. They're really very, very close because there's a huge overlap of interests and of outlooks on the global issues, including on trade. And so on that front, working more with the Europeans, bringing the Canadians in. My PhD was on comparing Canada and Australia, actually, so I'm sympathetic to that idea. And of course, India. Maybe you're right. I think there's a scope for us to maybe press India to revisit its decision to not go with RCEP and perhaps re-engage. So you're right. This is an exciting, actually creative moment. Potentially, the obverse to the crisis is the opportunity. Thanks.
Sorry, real quick, I want to squeeze in one more question from our online audience.
Right, thank you. We have one online question, not particularly addressed to any particular panelist, but it's going back to security issues. If the United States asks Seoul to take a more active role in its military activities against China, what specific new or additional security policy ideas should South Korea consider?
I think the context might be like, I think the context might be like Taiwan Strait crisis or southern South China Sea or East China Sea, wherever it is. That's very kind of difficult questions, and we actually in South Korea we have many discussions about that kind of situations, and we're simulating a lot of TTX and other scenarios. But if something happens, and if United States are kind of asking us to respond to Chinese kind of coercion or any provocative actions alone, I think it's pretty difficult to persuade kind of domestic audiences. If like at elite level, there might be kind of imperative to, strategically that is kind of plausible actions that we have to respond to Chinese coercion. But domestically, given that this kind of polarized domestic political situations, I think more than half, kind of populations might be unconvincing about why South Korea have to be engaged to U.S. China kind of conflict, not South Korea-China conflict. So,
Arias, can I just repetize that? Just if I can, I would challenge the premise of the question. And I had this discussion. I was in Europe recently. People saying, "Oh, what could Europeans do if there's a conflict in Taiwan?" The whole point is, it's about deterring a conflict, and there's a lot we can all do now to foster a questioning mindset that for anybody in Beijing who's contemplating crossing the Taiwan Strait to think twice. That the deterrent action, the deterrent effect of our collective ability to respond is actually quite significant. And the whole point is to, in my view, to foster a mindset in Beijing which says, not today, right? Because we can't be sure we're going to win, right? And that's the whole point. We don't want a war. It's not about coming to the war and what can you bring to the war. It's about how we prevent the war from happening. That's critical. And that is, I think, something where ongoing collaboration is really important, with a proactive approach that looks beyond this fear of the war and thinking about how do we actually capitalise on the freedom, the peace we have now, and make sure it lasts longer. And that's something we can all collaborate on. Thanks.
I can't wait to continue this conversation over lunch. For now, please give a big round of applause for panel one. We'll have a brief 5-minute break before panel two begins. All right, everyone, welcome to panel 2. For those online, thank you for sticking around. I'll jump right into this. We don't need to go with my opening remarks, although I did prepare some just in case. Sitting next to me is Dr. Vic Tran. She is a senior fellow at Verve Research and an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her research interests include grand strategy, maritime security, cybersecurity, and other issues at the intersection between geopolitics and technology. Next to her is Dr. Joseph Chin-Young Liao. He is the Tan Ka-Ki Chair in Comparative and International Politics at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is professor and former dean at the S. Rajatratnam School of International Studies and currently Dean of College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences at NTU Singapore. Yeah, he also, a little bit closer here, he held the inaugural Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asian Studies at Brookings. And as I said, these are very abridged biographies, so please definitely check out our event page to read our participants' full bios. In the meantime, Dr. Tran, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Arius, for the introductions, and many thanks to KEI for inviting me here. So for my papers, I started with, talking about Vietnam's approach toward great power competition, and then move forward to talk about the Vietnamese perspective on the outcome of the U.S. elections and expectation in terms of U.S.-Vietnam relations. But then I move on to discuss the developments, in the region and on the global stage that have implication for Vietnam. And then I talk about the decision from the second Trump administration that have real impact on Vietnam's U.S. relations. And then after that, I talk about, moving forward, how Vietnam will deal with the current situation, and then concluded my paper with some recommendation for both the U.S. and the Vietnamese governments. Yeah, so on Vietnam's approach toward great power competition, so it's even more broadly, I talk about the 5 principles of Vietnam grand strategies. So it's applied to also to the great power competition as well, but it's Vietnam's approach toward the entirely external world. So Vietnam's foreign affairs has been guided by 5 basic principles: independence, self-reliance, openness, multilateralization, and diversifications. And these principles, has been implemented to achieve Vietnam, primary goals. So like many other countries, Vietnam had the need to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But the way that Vietnam frames it is quite interesting. It says that the most important goal is to protect the socialist homeland of Vietnam. So that kind of intertwine the need to protect the country and the need to protect the communist regime in Vietnam. And then the second goal, so in the political report of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Vietnam, so the goals listed in that order. So first, the socialist homeland, and then the second goal is to maintain a peaceful environment because it's necessary as a foundation for sustainable economic and security of Vietnam. And then the third one is to leverage external forces for its own economic development. So that to say that Vietnam's aware that in order to develop its economy, it needs to engage with the external world and it needs partners. And the last one is not as primary as the 3, but it's show that Vietnam has ambition to elevate its international standings. And the purpose is that so it can have greater autonomy and lessen the impact of great power competition. And then moving on to the Vietnamese perspective on U.S. election. So Vietnam's state media, followed the election process very closely. So for them, it was seen as a tie race, and there was no surprise that Trump won the election. And immediately after the outcome, there was a Vietnamese diplomat gave an interview to a state media saying that he's quite optimistic that the U.S.-Vietnam relation will continue to grow because both Republican and Democrat parties want to strengthen relationship with Vietnam. And he was right if we looked into the last two administrations. So the first Trump, during that period, there was two aircraft carrier visits to Vietnam. And then the trade and investment grew significantly. And then under the Trump administration, the two countries elevated their relationship from a comprehensive partnership, jumped two levels to a comprehensive strategic partnership. So that, put the United States on the same level as traditional friends and partners like China and Russia. And then also the trade figures continue to grow significantly. So because of that, Vietnamese leaders think that they already has experience dealing with the first Trump administration, and they think that the United States still wants to compete with China. Because of that, Southeast Asia and include Vietnam continue to play important role in U.S. foreign policy. But then soon after that, we saw, worrying developments, in terms of U.S. relations with other countries in the region and the globe. So, one of the example is that, during the hearing confirmation for the Secretary of Defense, he couldn't name any members of ASEAN. So for a region, very diverse and, with difficult needs in terms of security. So if the Secretary of Defense couldn't answer such a basic question, then how can he understand the specific needs of each country in order to build a deeper defense cooperation with them? So that's one side. And then there was some report about the Trump administration kind of considering, stopping the expansion of U.S. presence in Japan. And given the importance of Japan's in U.S. Power projection in the region, without that, it's a clear sign that the U.S. is reducing its commitment to regional security. And for Vietnam, a country have a territorial dispute in the South China Sea with China is a very worrying sign. And then, when the U.S. Vice President criticized European allies on their domestic issue, it's a clear sign that for this administration, allies and partners are not important. So for a country like Vietnam, where it stands in the U.S. foreign policy, right? So, and then when the Trump administration cut aid to Ukraine, is for Vietnam, they just say, you can see that they can never trust the United States, can never rely on the United States. And then when the Trump administration kind of downplayed the threat from Russia and cozy up with Russia, I think it's a mixed reaction in Vietnam. So I think in the short term, it's kind of give Hanoi some space, strategic space, kind of breathing space, because for Vietnam, Russia is still an important partner. So it's unlikely, probably the Trump administration doesn't care that Hanoi has a good relationship with Moscow. But in the long term, if the United States, stop criticizing Russia on its invasion of Ukraine, then it's kind of undermining the principle of sovereignty that Vietnam will depend upon in the long future. And then when we look at different, decisions by the second Trump administration that, they have caused a lot of damages to bilateral relations. So with the first thing is when they stopped, the operation to clean up the Agent Orange in Bien Hoa Air Base, and also the operation for demining in Vietnam. There was a kind of a shock in Vietnam because people see that as obligation by the United States because they brought the toxic agent into Vietnam soil on the first place, and also they left the unexploded bomb during the war. So it was their obligation to clean them up. It's not charity. So in Vietnam, it's a real sense of betrayal when that happened. So I heard yesterday that those two, the fundings for those two operation resumed. But I think that the damage already been done, and trust can never be rebuilt back to the normal level. And then the dismantle of U.S. aid impacted many programs in Vietnam, including projects on Mekong, how to help Vietnam to mitigate the impact of Chinese dam in the upstream Mekong and other environmental concern. Because Mekong for Vietnam is a very important, it's a rice bowl of Vietnam. So without those efforts, Vietnam will face food security in the future. And then another non-traditional security issues is the cyber security. So the United States had been important partner in strengthening Vietnam's cyber capabilities. But with the stop of foreign aid, this will impact this initiative. And then, of course, we'd have the 46% of tariff recently. And for Vietnam, according to Vietnamese custom, export to the United States account for 29.5% of the country's total export. And even though that report didn't link it to GDP, but I have seen other reports saying that it equivalent to about 30% of Vietnamese GDP. So 46% tariff on that will have a very bad impact on the Vietnamese economy. So I think with that, in terms of the tariff question in particular, back in 2014, after China, sent an oil rig into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, Vietnam's, kind of started to worry about trade dependence with China, and the Vietnamese leaders have put forward different policy to encourage the country to diversify its economic partners to avoid dependence on any single countries. So from that, Vietnam has been very proactive in negotiating different free trade agreements. So as of today, Vietnam has been a part of 17 free trade agreements in total, 7 of which under ASEAN umbrella. So just to give you some context, in Southeast Asia, only Singapore and Vietnam have a free trade agreement with the European Union. That to say that Vietnam has been very committed in diversifying its partners, and also has tried to reform and meet higher standards to join those new generation free trade agreements. So on the policy front, Vietnam has been quite successful, but has to say that the implementation of those free trade agreements is more challenging because the majority of Vietnamese economies, include small and medium enterprise, and for these businesses, it's easier to do business with China because they need cheap imports for their own manufacturing. So that's the challenge why even with the 17 FTAs, Vietnam still heavily depends on China for its import. So that was the original concern, right? Concern about trade dependence on China. And now Vietnam wake up, realize that it also depends heavily on export to the US. And with the tariff, it's kind of dual vulnerability for Vietnam to deal with. So moving forward, I think Vietnam will have to, double down on its principle of diversification and be more self-reliant as well. So to conclude my paper, I have some recommendation for both the governments. So to the Trump administration, it seems obvious, but I think we have to collectively keep telling them that the United States cannot compete with China alone. So allies and partners are important. so including Vietnam. So they have to work with them. And in order to have a better relationship with Vietnam, trust is very important. So the United States need to be more reliable, more consistent in its behavior and policy, and be careful in framing their competition with China, in the sense that, focus on the U.S. should focus on the revisionist aspect of China, not the communist aspect, because Vietnam also has a communist party. So if they, because during the first Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo, he on in a news, he said that communists always lie. So that certainly, even though he targeted China in this that comment, but certainly didn't help with the relationship with Vietnam. And then to the Vietnamese government, I just suggest that they make better use of the 17 free trade agreement that they have to reduce trade dependence on any single countries and to have greater autonomy. Yeah, I stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Tran. Moving swiftly to Dr. Liao.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come here and speak, and a very good morning, still morning, very good morning to everyone. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this project, this team, and my beat, as it were, it was to cover Singapore. Yeah. And actually, the Prime Minister of Singapore, who is probably the most vocal voice in response to the Trump tariffs over the last few days from Asia. Yeah. He's spoken out quite clearly, quite resolutely in a sort of recording to the people, and also in the Singapore Parliament recently. So actually, you should just all go back and read that, and that's the statement. Yeah. So I wanted to start with that because his remarks was a matter of interest for a number of my American friends over the last few days, and they were asking me, does this indicate a shift in Singapore's view of the U.S. and positioning vis-a-vis the U.S.? And I was very puzzled by that question, and I threw it back to them. Who started it, right? I mean, why are you asking me whether there's a shift? We're just reacting to you guys who moved first. Yeah. So I think that's it's very important to bear that in mind, right? And just to sum up what the Prime Minister said, he basically said that this is not what friends do to other friends. Yeah. Now, as far as Singapore is concerned, in a sort of, I suppose, typical pragmatic, cynical Singapore style, we are looking at trying to find the least worst options in a basket of bad options. Yeah, that is before us. And another sort of governing principle in terms of approaching the Trump administration is, of course, to take Trump seriously, but not literally, because he is nothing if not inconsistent. Yeah, and this is why, for me personally, I get a bit concerned. I mean, no offense to Vietnam or Japan, but the Vietnamese and the Japanese, Japan says that, Abe somehow managed to figure Trump out, and so that's a template for us for Trump 2.0. Vietnam is very confident that they know how to manage this person based on their personal interactions with him, but he is a very inconsistent person. I mean, he can go to sleep at night very soundly with this inconsistency, right? He'll be best friends with a leader and then whack the country with tariff sanctions, whatever it is, and then have dinner. Yeah, so that's what we're dealing with. From Singapore's perspective, also currently, it's still a bit of a wait and see. There are a few things that we are waiting and seeing. The first is for additional clarity on the tariffs, because Liberation Day is not the end of it. Yeah, as we have come to know, right? Since, I mean, the situation with China is very alarming. But it's not just with China; it's with other countries. there's a proverbial queue to go and talk to Trump in the hope of getting tariffs lowered, exclusions, carve-outs, whatever it is, and the administration itself turning its attention to other issues that they might want to explore tariffs on, right? So there's still a lack of clarity there. There's lack of clarity on just how much and what Trump will want in exchange for security commitments. We know that it's going to be a very transactional process. What that transaction entails in terms of the details, that we don't yet know. Yeah, so we have to wait and see. Having said that, a caveat or a footnote, I think that the Defense Secretary Hexer's visit to the region recently was surprisingly well received. Yeah, he sort of said the things that the region was hoping to hear. Of course, whether or not they can follow through, that's a different thing. But nevertheless, yeah. And of course, thirdly, whether or not the US under Trump is into the practice of throwing friends under the bus, yeah, as part of this transactional approach. Yeah, whether what he did to, or what he threatened and tried to do to Zelensky and Ukraine is, basically a template for how America is going to conduct policy, or is it just a one-off Trump doing his thing? Yeah. Now, it's important for us to, when we think about Singapore, it's important for us to remember that Singapore really thrived in a world with a very different US playing a very different role for very different reasons and outcomes. Yeah, what we did was we made ourselves very relevant to that US. We invested very heavily in it, in its role and for its outcomes. Yeah, but all that has changed. Yeah, so and we're trying to deal and trying to adapt to that change. Of course, the big question that not only Singaporeans are thinking about, but I think everyone is thinking about is, are we looking at a blip, or are we looking at the start, or maybe not start, but certainly a continuation of a trend? Yeah, and that's something to be discussed. As far as what Trump wants and how and why it bears on a country like Singapore, not to belittle American friends who spend a lot of time thinking about American interests and America's strategic objectives. I think that, in my personal view, Trump, number one, just wants to be in the headlines every day. Yeah? So he wakes up every morning and he wants to make sure that he is the center of attention. And in order to be the center of attention and continue to be so, you kind of have to say things that rock the boat, right? That's how the media reacts to it, yeah? Which of course explains his inconsistency as well. He says something to attract all the attention when he then subsequently walks back on it. Number two, he wants to win the Nobel Prize. That one I think we all know. He makes no pretense about it. He doesn't hide it. He wants to win it because Obama won it, and of course, he's far more deserving than Obama for it. Number three, he wants to be the greatest leader of the greatest power in the world today, which essentially means that he's only interested in the great power game. Yeah. I think someone mentioned that earlier, and I totally agree. Of course, for a country like Singapore, that poses problems because we are a teeny-weeny country. We don't like great power games. I mean, we happily coexist with great powers and make friends with them, but we don't like it when great powers play the great power game at the expense of smaller powers. Yeah, so this is something that the question of the implications of the nature of this sort of diplomacy for Singapore is something that we are very concerned about. So let me move quickly to what some of the concerns that Singapore has, and if I may suggest, probably to some degree or other, Southeast Asia has as well. The first is whether there are people who can moderate Trump's protectionist instincts. Yeah. In 1.0, I think there were some of these individuals, they call them the adults in the room, right, who could have that effect. Of course, many of them were, had to leave or were fired, and then they were replaced and all that. But there were some who were prepared to push back and give assurances to friends, allies, and partners. We know that Trump 2.0 prioritized loyalty more than anything else. Not to say that the people he has in the administration are incompetent, I'm not saying that, but that was not a major priority for the president. Loyalty was. So the question is whether can this lot do that? Can they sort of mitigate some of this this effect? I think we have to wait and see, but thus far, how things have unfolded doesn't leave me with a lot of confidence. I hope I'm wrong and will be proven wrong, but that's how I see it thus far. Second, the impact obviously on regional trade and prosperity with the tariffs. I think we all know that that poses big challenges, both directly and indirectly, right? So for a country like Singapore, 10% tariffs, we were lucky, right? We got the lowest tier, and the direct impact on us will not be that great. I mean, it will be manageable. Yeah? But of course, the concern is not just bilaterally in terms of the impact on us, but how it affects the sort of regional climate, yeah, and how it affects our neighbors. So this is something that is of concern, and obviously the spiraling downwards of U.S. China relations over the last few days cause for great alarm. Number 3, alliance commitments. So if you look at comments that Trump has made about Greenland and Canada, again, this is not what you expect of countries that are supposed to be friends. Of course, it doesn't involve Singapore directly, but nevertheless, number 1, it does suggest how this president and his administration approaches long-standing relationships with other countries. And number 2, it is also suggestive of how this administration might approach relationships around us, yeah, with the Philippines, with Taiwan, with Japan, with South Korea. And of course, that would have a bearing on the region and on us as well. Yeah. But having said that, you would notice a very interesting difference in terms of how Asian countries and European countries have been dealing with Trump 2.0 so far, right? I think, at the risk of generalization, in Asia, setting aside China, which has its own dynamic with the US, everyone else is quite philosophical about it, right? We kind of accept it, take it on the chin, find a way to move on. Yeah, Europeans are up in arms, right? Howls of protests, in large part because of the situation in Ukraine and their firm belief that the Ukraine situation has a bearing on European security, a direct bearing on European security. But there's been this interesting difference. 4th point of concern, consultation. Those of you who are familiar with Southeast Asia and ASEAN, you know how important it is for us that we are consulted. Yeah. Whether you take us seriously or not, that's a separate issue. But talk to us, let us know. You have an idea for an initiative, a plan, a form of engagement, a vehicle of engagement. We want to be consulted. And for the most part, previous administrations have done that to some degree or other. Whether or not this administration is going to follow that template, we don't know. Honestly, we don't know. But I suspect it will be less inclined to consult with regional partners in Southeast Asia. Number 5, of course, unpredictability and the reliability of the United States that has been called into question now. I think, again, I won't belabor that point. I think we're all familiar with that. So let me move lastly to the question of options for Singapore, because I think this is something that was required of the project as well. So number one, you know that we have not engaged in reciprocal tariffs. Frankly, no point for us to do. I mean, it will be symbolic, but we don't want to do that anyway. So there's none of that. There will be a continued emphasis on, in terms of diplomacy, on what we have been doing with the United States all this while. Yeah, Singapore's cooperation, Singapore's relationship with the U.S. is deep and broad. I would suggest the deepest and broadest, certainly in Southeast Asia, possibly in the entire region. Yeah, you know, that's currency which, at least to us in Singapore, is very important in relation to the bilateral relationship. And we, I believe the leaders of Singapore have every intention to continue to emphasize that. In line with that, number three, Singapore is going to, in keeping with its tradition of pragmatism, I suppose, going to identify ways that it can continue to engage the United States to make itself relevant to the US and really sort of foreground that. Yeah, whether it's in the form of investments, whether it's in the form of just buying more from the US. But, you know, by the way, we already have a trade deficit with the US. We're one of a handful. I think it's Singapore and Colombia, right, that have a trade deficit with the US. But nevertheless, you know, if we have to buy more, we'll buy more. Yeah. Number four, Singapore will still reinforce the importance of the rules-based order. Not that we think that Trump will be persuaded or convinced, but it's you've heard this before from statements by Singaporean officials. It's a matter of principle for us. So by definition, it is something that we will continue to articulate and continue to reinforce with like-minded states. Number five, diversification of partnerships is something that Singapore has already been doing and will continue to do. In fact, I have every expectation that we're going to double down on that in terms of not just strategic partners, but also diversification of supply chains and things like that. Number six, a very interesting one, Singapore will have to double down on ASEAN. Yeah, warts and all. We can have a whole separate discussion about ASEAN and its shortcomings and its difficulties, you know, slow, cumbersome, blah, 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 all that. I think we all know that. But having said that, given the situation today, I think, I hope that all the ASEAN countries see it as imperative that they try to imagine how ASEAN can be used to shield themselves collectively from what is happening outside of the region. Yeah, as the saying goes, if you don't hang together, you're going to hang individually. Yeah. It will be challenging because the thing about ASEAN, unfortunately, is every time it's confronted with a real crisis, a lot of the member countries start to look inward. Yeah, inwardly, and it's a sort of instinctive response on the part of ASEAN. But I certainly hope that that is going to change. And last point is again, try to take advantage of the opportunities in the crisis. So, for example, we are spared, right, because we've got 10% tariffs. We've also got the most free trade agreements of any country in the world. So can we parlay that, into, can Singapore make itself kind of cost advantage for other countries in the region who are faced with larger tariffs, higher tariffs, to try to get access into the U.S. market. Not China, of course. That creates that opens a whole new can of worms, But other countries that are, not so much on the radar of the U.S. And I think that Singapore is actually theoretically in a position to facilitate greater regional access in semiconductors, in electronics, in telecoms equipment, which there is still very high demand in the US, and there is pretty high supply in the Asia-Pacific region, even factoring out China. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Happy to have a chat over Q&A.
I'll turn it over to the panel. Dr. Tran, if you have any comments, engagements. Again, it's more fun if we fight up here.
Yeah, so like Professor Liao also talked about the diversification, and that's the word everybody is talking about now, right? And like I mentioned, Vietnam has talked about diversification for at least 30 years, but how to implement it is another question. Yeah, and here I really want to mention India, because, with the size, India has similar size to China and has the potential to, challenge China and become a replacement of China in terms of, intermediate goods and capital goods for other countries for their own manufacturing, including Vietnam. Yeah, so I really hope that India will see this as an opportunity to open up the economy and do some reform. Yep.
Going to exercise my moderator privilege to ask the first question here. So, Dr. Tran, you had this, and this comes through in your draft as well, that on the one hand, Vietnam was not necessarily surprised that Trump won. I think that might not be the same of some other countries that were represented here today. So you're not surprised that Trump 2.0 came back. You're not surprised that he won the election. On the other hand, you did express some dismay from Vietnam's perspective about tariffs, about pulling out of U.S. aid agreements, about bilateral initiatives that have existed for decades. So I'm just wondering, what exactly didn't Vietnam expect from a second Trump administration? What has been the biggest surprise? And then on the other hand, we've talked a little bit as well about whether or not this is ephemeral, whether or not this first 90 days or so is going to be the same in 9 months. So are these concerns then, do you also think, yeah, look, we can muddle through, we can get past the stormy weather, as John put it on our last panel, and how much of this do you think is actually going to be a feature of the next 4 years?
Yeah. And hope to play nice, and then on the day, then Vietnam will receive some kind of so that caught them surprised that Vietnam among the countries with the highest rate. And now, when they step into the negotiation, those will not count anymore. So that's but again, that's what surprised them, that even with their efforts, they still got one of the highest rates. But for Vietnam, the U.S. system, I think that one of the main concern for them, because even during the Obama administration, Obama came in and clearly said that the U.S. respects Vietnam political system when they signed the comprehensive partnership, and made all efforts, to engage with Vietnam. And then similar, under the Biden administration, also a lot of emphasis on the importance of partners, including Vietnam, and reassure Vietnam from time to time. But, every 4 years, there's U.S. election, and there's no certainty who will be in power. And for Vietnam, it's one factor that Vietnam see that Vietnam can not rely on the U.S. Yep.
Thank you. We'll open up the floor to questions. And again, if you are watching online, please use the live chat feature to pose your inquiries. Any questions?
Chief, I can just make a quick observation.
Yes, of course.
Just a point, which I thought was quite interesting, because Vietnam and Singapore, I mean, if you look at discussions on Southeast Asia today, Vietnam and Singapore are generally recognized as, or seen to be, the two most sort of strategic, countries or thinkers,
Have very similar strategic outlook.
Yeah, and think strategically. Yeah, but at the same time, I thought it's interesting because the reactions of these two sort of similar strategic outlook thinkers, countries, to the tariffs were so different, right? Vietnam was still quite confident, even ebullient about it, right? Your Secretary General was, I think, the first to call, right? The first to get through. I'm sure everyone's picked up the phone, but he was the first one to get through, right? And he was quite confident. And the Prime Minister said that, oh, if I have to play golf with with Trump every day, I'll do that. And then, on the other hand, the Singapore Prime Minister says this is not what friends do to other friends. Yeah. So I thought, no question here, but I just thought this is a very interesting contrast in the context of two countries that actually are quite strategically aligned in terms of the perspectives on regional affairs.
Yeah, just to respond to that. So I think Vietnamese leaders see that because the 30% of total imports and GDP is not small at all. So that's why they have to do that, like be pragmatic in terms of response to Trump. But in another, article, I think it's from the Vietnam's news agency in English, targeting international audience, the Prime Minister said that the United States is the biggest, most important export market, but no mean the only one. So kind of like subtle pushback right there, yeah.
Thank you. Ben.
Thanks. This is Ben Sando from Global Taiwan Institute. Thank you so much for putting on this event. I just wanted to ask, because I'm curious about Singapore's exposure to these tariffs. I think it's a little bit easier for someone like me who's not in the economics and trade realm to understand the damage that an export-driven economy like Vietnam, exporting goods, that is, will the damage that they will incur. But Singapore exports financial services, and that's why you have a so-called trade deficit with America, because I think that's generally calculated in trade in goods, and so that's why it looks like you aren't necessarily exposed to these tariffs which are levied on goods. So I'm just curious, does Singapore actually feel the damage? And there's a fear that countries that really feel the damage might turn towards other partners, maybe in Singapore's case in China, but does Singapore see China as a realistic alternative to its services-driven, financial services-driven economy, or is it just the U.S. and the West or nothing?
Thanks for the question. So there are a few parts to that question. In the case of trade for Singapore, I mean, we are, if not the most open trading nation, certainly one of the most. Like I said, we have the most FTAs of any country. So trade is very important for us because we don't produce anything. So trade deficits in goods is quite, in keeping with the realities. We have to import everything, right? But we trade off on the service industry, which we we've invested very heavily in that. And we provide that, of course, not just for the United States, for the Europeans, for the Chinese, for anyone and everyone who wants to do business, right? So a lot of headquarters are centered in Singapore, and then they extend out into Southeast Asia, in some cases into the Asia Pacific. Yeah. But where it is a matter of grave concern for us is the climate of protectionism and mercantilism that is casting a very ominous shadow, right, over the world, right, triggered by the Trump tariffs, because the concern is the cascading effect. So just by way of illustration, so the Chinese have been practically shut out of the American market, right? In terms of their and the Chinese economy is not doing great, right? What's going to help them turn it around? They've got many ideas, but I believe that at the end of the day, exports are still integral for that effort, because domestic consumption is not increasing nearly at the rate that they want and need. In terms of debt, the provincial governments have been debted out already, so they still have to rely on exports. They can't get into the American market. They got to look for other markets, right? And they're looking very much at Southeast Asia, because trade relations with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN, over the last few years have been number one. ASEAN has been China's number one trading partner, surpassed the United States and EU, I think 2022, 2023, something like that. Yeah, but herein lies the rub, because you have Chinese overcapacity. They want to ship it to ASEAN, right? And what that is going to mean is they're going to compete with many ASEAN economies that also want to build up manufacturing, especially low-end manufacturing capabilities, the Indonesias, the Vietnams, the Thailands of the world. So there is a parallel discussion now in Southeast Asia about protection and tariffs on China, right? And given that the biggest economy in the world, the United States, has essentially recast global economic relations, everyone, or theoretically, if everyone starts to take dressing from that, then you have a big problem. Countries like Singapore will have a big problem, because prices are going to go up, demand is going to go down, protectionist walls are going to grow higher. All that for open trading economy, that's quite disastrous. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll go online.
Right, thank you. Again, this is not directed to any particular speaker, but this questioner asks, what kind of measures, collective measures, can ASEAN states take to bring more leverage in trade discussions to come? So, for example, how can ASEAN collectively work with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, European Union, etc.?
Yes, so Professor Liu hoped that ASEAN will play a more important role, but here I have to say very difficult, because, like Singapore and Vietnam have, free trade agreements with many countries, but the rest of Southeast Asia don't. So we can't make a collective stand to work with same partners, right? Because of that, and also like from what we saw, like the Vietnamese was the first one to make the move. Didn't wait for ASEAN at all. So difficult, yeah.
Yeah, I have to agree. ASEAN, if you study ASEAN, you know that ASEAN is anything first and foremost an aspirational. ASEAN is all about aspirations. Yeah. So in that ASEAN spirit, I'm also aspirational in terms of hoping that ASEAN will see in this moment of its history, I suppose, an imperative to really start to work together to bring down tariff and non-tariff barriers within the region and within countries. Yeah. In terms of infrastructure development and things like that. But having said that, while ASEAN certainly aspires for deeper economic integration and cooperation, the reality also is that there is a very sharp competitive element to relations within ASEAN, right? Let me put it quite simply. The economies that are at the lower end of the value chain have no intention of being there in perpetuity, right? In fact, everyone, take data centers for example. Everyone wants data centers now because it's the in thing, right? To be seen as an economy on the move, you gotta ride the AI bandwagon, right? And part of it is data centers. So everyone is trying to develop data centers at assuming that they are able to develop that industry. The costs that their economy has to bear for having that industry, in some cases, it's going to be very onerous, you know. But nevertheless, to keep up with the Joneses, right? You have to do that. Yeah. So so any sort of theoretical logic of comparative advantage, you know, as economic theory teaches us, it makes sense, but it assumes that economies are sort of satisfied with where they are in the value chain. But in reality, that's not the case, right? Because politics comes into the picture, right? And if you have populist politicians, even more so. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, significant obstacles.
Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Chi Vu. I'm a student at Georgetown University. My question is a follow-up to Dr. Leo's point on how ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries can band together. Definitely a follow-up of that of the previous question too. I wonder what you, both experts, think what would be the most practical conversations and imminent conversations that can happen in ASEAN right now for countries to come together. Also, to the point that Singapore can help facilitate the access from other countries in the region to kind of help alleviate that excess from their economies now as the effect the tariffs comes in. I wonder what the implementation of that strategy would look like. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I think it's already too late for ASEAN to have a kind of a common response to the tariff. But after the initial reaction, right, maybe they can talk together, like Professor Liao mentioned earlier. They can increase the intra-regional trade. I think that's the most practical way. And Vietnam has, has done some steps to prepare for that. Because for the last 2-3 years, Vietnam really stepped up in upgrading its relationship with other countries. So it first focused on major countries. So upgrading relationship with from 2022 was from South Korea, and then Japan, the United States, Australia, France, to comprehensive strategic partnership. And then in addition to New Zealand, and then now Vietnam focus on ASEAN members. So now there are 3 ASEAN members also up to the CSP level. So first were Malaysia, and then Indonesia and Singapore. So with that CSP, Vietnam have very good excuse to start talking to them to increase trade relations.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, there are certain areas that they are working on already, which they should really double down. Like, for example, in terms of digital connectivity, e-commerce payment platforms, common platform across the region to facilitate ease of transaction, which of course will also facilitate ease of movement of people. Yeah, so that's something that I can think of in terms of by way of specifics. But this question of a sort of common ASEAN response, yeah, I think the ship has in a sense sailed. Of course, Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, because Malaysia is the chair of ASEAN this year, right? So he has stated that he wants to pull together a common ASEAN response. And I think, in fact, today or tomorrow, the ASEAN economic ministers are having a meeting in order to sort of come up with some kind of common response. But I thought it was interesting for two reasons. Number one, the Prime Minister Anwar had picked up the phone to call some, but not all, ASEAN members. I don't know whether he's eventually called all, but up to a couple of days ago, basically it was Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, I think, didn't call Vietnam. Yeah, the founding members. Yeah, but ASEAN, of course, is more than the founding members. So I don't know whether he's touched base with the rest. But anyway, there is going to be an ASEAN meeting. Second, Malaysia wants to pull together a common response, which will require them as chair to sort of engage in DC, right? You would imagine. The funny thing is, Malaysia has no ambassador, and Malaysia has no DCM, as far as I know, in the embassy here, right? They called the ambassador, well, the ambassador finished his term or whatever, Nasri Aziz, went back. So left early, okay. So, but anyway, he's not there, and there's no DCM there. So who's gonna be the one sort of leading that engagement in DC? I don't know. Yeah, so some challenges there, I think.
Dr. Tran, Dr. Liao, thank you so much. Okay, just a few brief announcements before we break for lunch. So, firstly, this episode will be available on YouTube on the Korea Economic Institute of America's YouTube channel. This can't think of the word. See, this is why we need lunch. The next edition of Korea Policy will be coming out in late May, early June. Everybody who RSVP'd here today will be getting an exclusive download link once that goes live, so keep an eye out for that. Next week, if you would like to come to our event, we have another one called Geoeconomic Strategy, Industrial Policy in Comparative Context. That's going to be on April 16th with KEI non-resident fellow and economics professor at Montclair State University, Dr. Sun-Young Lee. And make sure to check out keia.org to keep up to speed on all of our events. You can follow us on LinkedIn and follow us on X, whichever platform works best for you. And finally, you can find our podcasts. You can find all audio from our events on our YouTube channel, as well as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whichever platform works best for you. Thank you so much.